Listen, there's a moment in life when you stop arguing, you stop explaining, and you stop trying to convince someone to treat you better. And that moment, right there, is where your power comes rushing back. Today, we're talking about silence, not the angry kind, not the passive, aggressive kind. I'm talking about intentional, educated, self-protective silence. Here's what most people don't understand. Your silence isn't about punishing a narcissist. It's about protecting yourself. Narcissists feed on reaction. Your frustration, your explanations, your tears, your defense. Those are like oxygen to them. They survive on your emotional energy because it keeps them in control. They know as long as you're reacting, they still matter, they still have influence, they still dominate the space. But when you go silent, when you stop responding, when you finally realize that you don't owe them one more ounce of explanation, you flip the power dynamic instantly because your silence says two things louder than any argument. I see what you're doing, and I'm not playing this game anymore. A narcissist expects you to break the silence. They expect you to chase, to fix, to clarify. So when you don't, it hits them harder than you think. Not because they suddenly grow empathy, but because they lose their grip on the control they've always counted on. Let's be clear, your silence is not about winning. It's not about revenge. This is about education and self-preservation. When you stop engaging, you remove the reward they get from manipulating the conversation. You remove the fuel they get from your emotional reactions. You remove the cycle that keeps you exhausted and keeps them in power. And something remarkable happens. In your silence, you learn. You learn what healthy communication should feel like. You learn what boundaries look like. You learn that peace doesn't come from controlling others, it comes from controlling your choices. Your silence becomes your teacher. You begin to see that you don't need to raise your voice to reclaim your life. You just need to rise above the chaos that once felt normal. And the narcissist, they feel that silence like a door closing, because it is. So here's your reminder. Choosing silence is choosing yourself. It is choosing clarity over chaos. It is choosing emotional intelligence over emotional entanglement. And most importantly, it is choosing to walk away from what hurts you and toward what heals you. Stand in that silence. Own it, grow in it, because your long silence will hit the narcissist harder than you expect and empower you more than you ever imagined. Narcissists crave control because control is the foundation of how they maintain emotional dominance in their relationships. Their identity, confidence, and sense of superiority depend on being the center of attention and the director of every emotional exchange. When they talk, they expect you to listen. When they accuse, they expect you to defend yourself. When they manipulate, they expect you to feel confused. This constant need for emotional authority is not random. It is the way a narcissist validates their sense of power and importance in the world. Control for them is not optional, it's oxygen. Every reaction you give, whether it's explaining yourself, arguing, crying, apologizing, or trying to fix the situation, feeds a narcissist's psychological needs. They interpret your responses as proof that you're still under their influence. Even negative attention is a win for them because it still keeps you emotionally engaged. What they fear most is not anger or conflict. What they fear is irrelevance. Your silence becomes a threat to their psychological ecosystem because it removes the very thing they rely on, your emotional participation. A narcissist expects every situation to revolve around them. They expect immediate replies, emotional explanations, and an ongoing cycle where they provoke and you react. When that pattern suddenly stops, it creates internal chaos for them. This isn't because they care about your feelings or the relationship itself, but because they've lost control of the emotional narrative. Silence exposes something they work very hard to avoid: accountability. When you stop responding, they can no longer twist your words, shift blame, or manipulate your emotions. They are forced to sit with their own behavior, even if they don't fully acknowledge it. Without your reactions to distract them, they confront the uncomfortable reality that their usual tactics aren't working. And for a narcissist, that sense of losing control is deeply unsettling. Your silence also disrupts the power dynamic they depend on. They can't guilt-trip silence. They can't argue with silence. They can't dominate silence. It is the one response that gives them nothing to hold on to. In their mind, silence means you're slipping away from their influence, and that loss of power triggers panic, frustration, and sometimes an escalation of manipulative behaviors as they try to pull you back into the cycle. But the key here is understanding the educational value of this dynamic. When you recognize how much a narcissist depends on controlling your reactions, you begin to understand the psychological mechanics of manipulation. You start to see that their need for control has nothing to do with love or connection and everything to do with ego and insecurity. This awareness empowers you to make healthier decisions. It teaches you that stepping back is not weakness. It is emotional intelligence. And it reinforces the truth that you don't have to participate in a dynamic that drains your energy and diminishes your self-worth. Silence doesn't just disrupt their control, it restores yours. Detachment is one of the most powerful tools you have when dealing with a narcissist because it removes the emotional fuel they depend on to sustain their behavior. A narcissist thrives on attention, good, bad, or chaotic. They don't discriminate. Your praise inflates them, your anger excites them, your confusion empowers them, and your explanations reassure them that you're still emotionally tied to their world. When you emotionally detach, you cut off the entire supply chain that keeps their ego alive and functioning at your expense. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring about yourself or the situation. It means you stop participating in the emotional tug-of-war that the narcissist has come to expect. You stop reacting to their provocations. You stop defending your every move. You stop allowing them to draw you into circular arguments designed only to exhaust you. You step back, not out of fear, but out of clarity. And when you do, you begin to see the relationship dynamic for what it truly is. A system that benefits them and drains you. The moment you detach emotionally, something shifts. You start recognizing the patterns you were too overwhelmed to see before. You realize how often you've been pulled into drama that wasn't yours. You notice the way small comments were used to trigger big reactions. You see how every argument somehow circled back to you being wrong, even when you weren't. This awareness is the true beginning of taking your power back. For the narcissist, however, your detachment is destabilizing. They are accustomed to you being emotionally available, always ready to react, explain, apologize, or soothe. When you suddenly stop feeding that dynamic, they feel a sort of emotional starvation, not because they value your feelings, but because they've lost the dependable supply of attention that made them feel in control. Your silence is confusing, your calm is unsettling, and your lack of reaction is a direct threat to their sense of superiority. This is why detachment often leads to increased attempts to pull you back in. They may become overly charming, overly angry, or even play the victim. They rotate through whatever strategy they believe will extract the emotional response they crave. But the more you hold your boundaries, the more they are forced to confront the reality that they cannot control your inner world. And for someone who relies on emotional dominance to maintain their self-image, that loss is deeply unsettling. Most importantly, detachment gives you the space to reconnect with your own emotional needs. When you stop focusing on their reactions, you begin focusing on your asterisk healing. You start understanding what peace feels like. You learn to differentiate between love and manipulation, between connection and control, between genuine care and psychological dependency. This emotional clarity is what allows real transformation to happen. By detaching, you are not abandoning yourself. You are returning to yourself. You are reclaiming your emotional space, your energy, and your right to live without manipulation. When you choose silence, you remove the emotional reactions that a narcissist relies on to avoid accountability. Narcissists are experts at shifting attention away from their behavior. They deflect, blame, minimize, exaggerate, and twist conversations so skillfully that you often end up feeling responsible for things that were never your fault. As long as you're speaking, explaining, or defending yourself, they have material to manipulate. Your words become puzzle pieces they rearrange to suit their narrative. But when you take away those pieces, when you stop engaging, they lose the ability to rewrite the story in their favor. Silence creates a space where they can no longer hide behind your reactions. It forces them to exist in a scenario where there is nothing to deflect, nothing to argue with, and nothing to twist. They are left with only themselves, something they work very hard to avoid. A narcissist rarely reflects inward because it threatens the fragile ego they constantly protect. But your refusal to respond interrupts their usual escape routes. They can't blame you if you're not talking. They can't make you the villain if you're not engaging. They can't provoke chaos if you're not reacting. This is why silence feels so uncomfortable for them. It's a mirror they didn't ask for, reflecting their own behavior back at them. Even if they never admit it out loud, they feel the weight of that emotional stillness. They sense that something isn't working. They feel the shift in control, and deep down, they know the reason they no longer hear your voice is because their actions pushed you into silence. That realization, whether conscious or subconscious, is a form of accountability they cannot easily escape. They might try to break the silence by provoking you with guilt, anger, charm, or even false promises of change. These attempts aren't genuine. They are attempts to restore the emotional dynamic they're comfortable with. They want you reacting again so they can continue avoiding responsibility. But every time you hold your silence, you reinforce a powerful message. Their behavior has consequences. Silence also changes the rhythm of the relationship. Narcissists rely on a predictable pattern: poke, provoke, and watch you respond. When that rhythm stops, they lose their emotional leverage. They can no longer anticipate your reactions or control the direction of the conversation. Your stillness becomes a barrier they can't penetrate. It creates a pause that prevents their usual emotional chaos from unfolding, and in that pause, accountability naturally emerges. But the most important part of this process is what it does for you. Silence gives you the space to see the situation clearly. You're no longer overwhelmed by arguments, accusations, or emotional traps. You can observe their behavior from a distance instead of being caught in the storm. This clarity teaches you what accountability truly looks like, and it shows you how often you've carried responsibility that was never yours. In the end, silence creates accountability not by punishing the narcissist, but by freeing you from their control. It breaks the cycle of emotional manipulation and gives both sides a moment of truth, one the narcissist tries to avoid and one you finally deserve. Silence has a way of bringing you back to yourself, especially after being entangled in a dynamic where your emotions, reactions, and self-worth have been tied to someone else's behavior. When you stop engaging with a narcissist's chaos, something powerful happens internally. You begin to rebuild, slowly, quietly, and steadily. Your silence becomes a space where your thoughts can finally breathe, where your emotions can settle, and where your confidence can regenerate without being constantly challenged or drained. For so long, your energy may have been directed outward, trying to explain your intentions, defend your choices, justify your feelings, or repair situations that weren't your responsibility to fix. The narcissist's constant demands, criticisms, or manipulations can leave you feeling depleted, disconnected, and unsure of your own judgment. Silence interrupts that pattern. It places a pause between you and the noise. And in that pause, you begin to reconnect with the parts of yourself you may have lost along the way. This is where your power starts to rebuild. You start noticing the thoughts and instincts you used to ignore. You realize how often you compromised your boundaries just to maintain peace. You see the moments when you abandoned your own needs to keep the relationship functioning. Silence brings these realizations to the surface, not to punish you, but to educate you. It shows you what your inner voice sounds like without someone else drowning it out. And for many people, hearing that voice again is the first step toward healing. Your silence also creates emotional space where self-respect can grow. When you stop arguing or explaining, you are telling yourself, my peace matters, my energy matters, my boundaries matter. This shift is profound. You begin to prioritize your well-being instead of prioritizing their reactions. You choose emotional stability over emotional chaos. You choose clarity over confusion. Each of these choices strengthens your sense of autonomy. Over time, this internal strengthening shows up in your behavior. You become less reactive and more reflective. You stop personalizing their behavior because you begin to see it for what it truly is, a reflection of their internal struggles, not your worth. You start responding from a place of wisdom instead of fear. You stop chasing closure from someone who was never capable of providing it. Instead, you create your own closure by reclaiming your narrative. This restoration of power isn't loud. It doesn't happen through confrontation or dramatic endings. It happens through the quiet consistency of choosing yourself day after day. Your silence becomes a boundary that protects your mental and emotional health. It becomes a reminder that you no longer allow anyone to dictate how you feel about yourself. It becomes a declaration of independence from the patterns that once drained you. And perhaps the most liberating part is that, through silence, you finally understand that your value doesn't come from being heard by someone who never listened. It comes from hearing yourself again. Your silence is not emptiness. It is rebuilding. It is reclaiming. It is rediscovering. It is the moment you step back into your own strength and realize you never truly lost it. You just needed space to find it again. Silence becomes one of the most valuable teachers you will ever learn from, especially when you're healing from a relationship with a narcissist. When you step back and stop responding, you create a pause, a psychological timeout that allows you to study the situation from a distance rather than from inside the emotional storm. In that quiet space, patterns that were once invisible suddenly become crystal clear. You start to understand not only the narcissist's behavior, but also your own habits, triggers, and emotional responses. This is where deep self-education begins. For the first time in a long time, you're not caught in a cycle of reacting. You're not being pulled into arguments designed to confuse you or forced into conversations that drain your energy. Instead, you're observing, you're learning, you're noticing the tactics that once manipulated you, and you're recognizing the emotional traps you used to fall into. This awareness is a form of emotional intelligence that can only grow when the noise stops. Through silence, you learn the difference between healthy communication and psychological manipulation. You learn what it feels like when someone respects your boundaries, and what it feels like when someone repeatedly crosses them. You begin to understand the emotional cost of constantly explaining yourself to someone who never truly listens. You start to see how your desire to fix, soothe, or maintain peace kept you stuck in patterns that weren't serving you. These lessons, although sometimes painful, are incredibly empowering because they reshape the way you approach relationships going forward. Silence teaches you how to prioritize your emotional safety. When you're no longer immersed in chaos, your nervous system starts to stabilize. You begin to understand what peace feels like, not the temporary calm before another conflict, but genuine emotional balance. You learn to identify the early signs of manipulation before they escalate. You learn to trust your instincts again. You learn that your intuition was never wrong. You were just too overwhelmed to hear it. This inner education transforms the way you communicate. You become more intentional with your words, more selective with your energy, and more protective of your boundaries. You stop oversharing with people who don't deserve access to your inner world. You stop engaging in conversations that go nowhere. You stop explaining your worth to people who refuse to see it. Your silence becomes a guide, teaching you when to speak, when to stay quiet, and when to walk away entirely. Perhaps the most important lesson silence teaches is that your healing is your responsibility, not the narcissist's. You learn that waiting for them to change, apologize, or acknowledge their behavior only delays your recovery. Silence teaches you to focus inward instead of outward. It teaches you that closure comes from understanding, not from someone else's validation. In this sense, silence becomes a form of self-education that strengthens your emotional independence. It teaches you resilience, clarity, and self-awareness. It prepares you to build healthier relationships grounded in respect rather than control. It allows you to move forward with wisdom instead of resentment. Through silence, you don't just learn about the narcissist. You learn about yourself, and that knowledge becomes the foundation of your strength, your healing, and your future. Here is a powerful Mel Robbins style conclusion that ties the entire message together. In the end, silence is not about shutting someone out. It's about finally letting yourself in. It's the moment you decide that your peace matters more than their chaos, your clarity matters more than their control, and your healing matters more than their ego. Silence is the turning point where you stop fighting to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. It's where you reclaim your energy, your boundaries, and your sense of self. By stepping back, you break the cycle that kept you exhausted. You stop feeding a dynamic that was never balanced, and you give yourself room to see the truth. You were never powerless. You were overwhelmed. You were never weak. You were emotionally invested, and you were never stuck. You just needed space to hear your own voice again. So let your silence stand. Let it teach you, protect you, and strengthen you. Let it be the line that separates who you were from who you're becoming. Because when you finally choose silence, you're choosing a future built on self-respect, emotional intelligence, and genuine peace. Your silence isn't the end of your strength. It's the beginning of it.